Something landed on my desk this morning that should make every economic planner in North America completely rethink how trade leverage actually works. It wasn't a political press release or a vague diplomatic briefing. It was a single devastating sheet of raw trade data from Statistics Canada covering March 2025. That document recorded a 24.8% monthly surge in Canadian merchandise exports to non-US countries. Let that number sink in. A 24.8% spike in a single 30-day window. It represents the second largest monthly export surge in the history of the Canadian Republic, while the mainstream media was busy writing obituaries for the Canadian economy. The structural architecture of global trade was quietly shifting underneath our feet. For decades, the conventional wisdom in Washington was that Canada was an economic hostage. When Donald Trump signed the executive orders on February 1, 2025, slapping a 25% tariff on nearly all Canadian imports and a 10% toll on energy products, the calculation was cold, simple, and absolute. The White House believed Canada had nowhere else to go. At that exact moment, Canada was funneling 73% of its total exports directly across the southern border. That is not a trading partnership. It is an economic umbilical cord. Trump intended to squeeze that cord until Ottawa submitted. But instead of triggering a domestic collapse, that intense pressure catalyzed the most aggressive, rapid trade diversification pivot in modern economic history. If you want to understand how global power dynamics actually shift when the chips are down, make sure you are subscribed to Money Signals and hit that like button. This is the raw architecture of sovereignty they will never show you on the corporate news. To see this full chessboard, we have to look at the exact timeline of how this economic counteroffensive was sequenced. This was not a chaotic, panicked reaction. It was a highly coordinated, multi-stage maneuver. The timeline begins on February 1, 2025, with the immediate shock of the American tariff declaration. The initial response from Ottawa under Justin Trudeau was fast and transactional. Canada immediately deployed 25% counter-tariffs, targeting an initial $30 billion of American goods. Within 3 short weeks, Ottawa escalated that retaliatory package to $15.5 billion USD, hammering American orange juice, steel, plastics, and household manufacturing. This was the first strategic signal. Canada would ensure the economic pain flowed in both directions without waiting for diplomatic backchannels. Then came the structural turning point. By March 2025, Mark Carney, the former governor of both the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England, stepped into the Prime Minister's office. Carney is not a traditional politician who flinches when market data turns volatile. He is a veteran central banker who views geopolitics through the lens of currency mechanics and long-term capital flows. His very first move was to double down on the defensive line. Ottawa slapped an additional $29.8 billion in counter-tariffs directly targeting US steel and aluminum, pushing the total Canadian retaliatory package far beyond what Wall Street or Washington economists had modelled. But while those political fireworks dominated the front pages, the real permanent structural shift was happening away from the spotlight. In that exact month of March 2025, while Canadian exports to the United States dropped by 6.6%, the sharpest decline since the absolute peak of the 2020 pandemic, the non-US export machine ignited. That 24.8% monthly surge to overseas markets was the first definitive proof that the American leverage model was broken. The full-year data released by Global Affairs Canada at the end of 2025 locked this transformation into historical reality. Annual goods exports to non-US countries rose by 17.2%, injecting an extra $69 billion into overseas trade volume, a 14.3% macro jump. Consequently, the US share of Canadian goods exports cratered from 75.9% down to 71.7%. That is the lowest reliance on the American market recorded since the early 1980s. The weaponization of trade didn't isolate Canada. It forced Canada to achieve its most diversified export footprint in 40 years. The unexpected centerpiece of this entire economic breakout was gold. Canada is a top-tier global gold producer, but the 2025 trade war unlocked a massive targeted urgency for liquid non-American asset placement. Unwrought gold exports surged by an astonishing 41.7% across the full year. Specifically, gold exports to the United Kingdom hit an all-time record of $29 billion. The London bullion market became Canada's financial pressure valve during the tightest months of the trade dispute, with RBC Economics confirming a 76% nominal dollar surge in gold flows to the UK. Gold instantly became Canada's second-largest export commodity, sitting directly behind crude oil. This regional economic transformation manifested city by city across the country. Calgary's non-US exports exploded by 64.67% between 2024 and 2025, driven by a rapid reallocation of energy and resource contracts. Simultaneously, the Ottawa-Gatineau region posted a nearly identical 64.04% increase in non-US trade, led by technology and specialized services, while Toronto expanded its overseas commercial footprint by 32.2%. The Canadian Chamber of Commerce verified that across every single province, non-US exports grew by an average of 16.8% on an annual basis. The trade war did not kill Canadian commerce, it violently redirected it. Canadian crude oil that historically flowed exclusively south was routed across the Atlantic to Germany and the Netherlands. Singapore and Hong Kong became major destinations for Canadian precious metals. Most dramatically, the agricultural sector broke its chains. Historically, the United States absorbed 95% of all Canadian canola oil exports. By mid-2025, that near monopoly collapsed, with the US share dropping to 64.5% as South Korea, Malaysia, and Mexico stepped in to absorb the supply. This historic rerouting was made possible by a critical piece of national infrastructure that Washington completely factored out of its calculations: the Trans Mountain Expansion Pipeline, or TMX. For generations, Canadian crude was logistically trapped, entirely dependent on American pipeline networks and forced to sell at a severe discount. The TMX expansion fundamentally changed the geopolitical calculus by unlocking massive export capacity on the Pacific coast. For the first time in history, Canadian heavy crude could bypass American infrastructure entirely and sail directly to the fastest-growing energy markets in Asia. Japan, South Korea and China transitioned from theoretical options into active, volume buyers. The infrastructure that critics claimed would take too long to matter instantly became Canada's ultimate strategic asset. Trump's tariffs inadvertently accelerated the absolute economic case for every pipeline and deep water port Canada had ever built. However, a cold, analytical look at the data reveals that this transformation was not entirely seamless. A comprehensive report from the Canadian Chamber of Commerce exposed a stark division in how this diversification actually operated on the ground. The data shows that only 6% more individual Canadian companies started selling to non-US markets year over year. What that tells us is that the massive surge in overseas trade was driven almost entirely by existing, large-scale multinational resource exporters expanding their reach. Smaller, domestic businesses lacked the capital to pivot overnight. They were forced to absorb the tariff pain, raise prices, or freeze their expansion plans. Fully 90% of non-exporting Canadian firms remained locked into local operations. Furthermore, the manufacturing heartlands of Ontario and Quebec endured severe localized trauma. Sectors like steel, automotive parts and lumber cannot simply redirect their physical supply chains to Europe or Asia without intense friction. RBC Economics quantified the raw damage. Canadian merchandise exports to the US fell by $34.6 billion across the full year of 2025. That is a massive economic hit to industrial workers in the manufacturing corridor. Yet, here is the macroeconomic data point that baffled every conventional forecaster on Wall Street. During that exact same 12-month period, Canadian exports to non-US markets rose by $28.6 billion. Canada successfully replaced nearly 83 cents of every single lost American trade dollar with an overseas alternative inside a single calendar year. No mainstream economist predicted that scale of mitigation speed when the tariffs first landed. Mark Carney understood a fundamental rule of geopolitical leverage that the tariff architects in Washington completely ignored. Canada controls the baseline commodities that the global economy requires to function. Whether it is oil, gold, uranium, potash, or nickel, when you produce the physical building blocks of the modern world, buyers will always find a way to your door. The trade war forced Canada to call Washington's bluff, and the global market answered. Recognizing this, Carney's administration fast-tracked regulatory approvals for nation-building infrastructure projects. streamlining the legal frameworks for highways, rail lines, and port expansions. Canada wasn't just acquiring new customers, it was completely rebuilding its physical delivery architecture. By August 2025, the diplomatic temperature shifted. The United States issued clarifications stating that compliant Canadian goods would receive tariff exemptions. In response, Canada dismantled its retaliatory measures on those imports by September 1st, clearing over 85% of total bilateral trade volume from the tariff regime, while domestic political critics labelled the move a capitulation. The underlying trade data showed that the diversification momentum could not be reversed. In September 2025, Canada posted a 6.3% monthly export gain, driven by a 22.7% surge in metals and minerals. Aircraft and transportation equipment shipments jumped 23.4%, anchored by a massive 72.3% surge in commercial aviation exports. By October, non-US exports hit another historic record high, with gold shipments to the UK climbing 47.4% in a single month, while crude oil-filled tankers bound for Northern Europe. The country that was expected to buckle under pressure was instead systematically breaking its own export records month after month. By December 2025, the transformation was set in stone. Non-US exports rose another 5.8%. In the final month of the year, aircraft exports hit a record $3.5 billion, and the Canadian dollar actually strengthened by 1.3 cents against the US dollar, marking its largest single-month gain of the year. The spring 2026 federal budget update officially confirmed that Canada had generated $33 billion in brand-new, non-American export revenue in 2025. This is the financial equivalent of standing up an entirely new global trading relationship from absolute scratch in less than 12 months. As we moved into early 2026, the data proved this was not a temporary blip. February 2026 saw total exports climb to $64.3 billion, with automotive parts rebounding by 24.2% and passenger vehicle shipments surging 40.6%. Agricultural exports to China, specifically barley and soybeans, jumped 29.1%. Then, March 2026 delivered the definitive blow to the old trade narrative. A second consecutive record-breaking month where non-US exports rose 9.1% to hit $24.3 billion. Unwrought gold, silver, and platinum group metals alone increased by $3 billion in that single month. The structural reality confronting global economists now is that trade routes, once forged under crisis, rapidly develop their own institutional gravity. Shipping contracts are signed, deep water infrastructure is paid for, and global supply chains are permanently re-engineered. The canola oil flowing to South Korea, the crude oil loading at the Pacific TMX terminal for Japan, and the gold integrated into London's financial systems represent permanent, long-term realignments. The ultimate irony of Donald Trump's trade offensive is glaring. He imposed tariffs to shrink the US trade deficit with Canada. But by forcing Ottawa to activate its decades-old, dormant diversification instincts, he didn't shrink the deficit. He merely made it irrelevant to Canada's survival. Canada found new buyers, insulated its sovereign economy, and stopped caring about Washington's policy whims. But as the dust settles on this historic shift, a far deeper, more volatile question is beginning to emerge beneath the surface of the global financial architecture. That deep question doesn't just challenge the future of North American commerce. It fundamentally deconstructs the mechanics of modern economic warfare. To truly understand why Washington blinked in late August 2025, we have to look past the political grandstanding and dissect the hidden architecture of the settlement itself. This wasn't a standard diplomatic compromise. It was a cold, calculated transaction engineered by a prime minister who treated a geopolitical crisis like a restructuring operation on a global scale. When Mark Carney sat down to map out the resolution to the tariff stalemate, he did not rely on traditional diplomatic leverage. He used the only language the tariff architects in the United States could not ignore: macroeconomic compliance and supply chain reality. By August 2025, the pressure on the American manufacturing sector from Canada's aggressive counter-tariffs, paired with the sudden diversion of critical raw materials eastward, had created severe friction in industrial states like Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. The settlement that emerged was structured entirely around what the White Papers termed cosmic compliance, a highly technical trade enforcement architecture that effectively transformed the bilateral border from a political battleground into a old regulatory sieve. To understand how this deal functions under the surface, we must break down its concrete components, its strategic terms, and the key institutional players who quietly held the pens. The architecture of the August 2025 agreement rests on three distinct pillars. First, the establishment of the bilateral regulatory enforcement framework. This mechanism was designed to directly address the White House's public grievances regarding border security and illicit transshipments. Under this provision, Canada agreed to deploy an integrated tracking system managed jointly by the Canada Border Services Agency and the US Customs and Border Protection. This framework provides real-time, asset-level transparency for every single shipment of raw metals, agricultural goods, and manufactured components crossing the border. The strategic compromise here was subtle but massive, by granting the US data-level visibility into Canadian transit hubs. Ottawa removed the political pretext for blanket tariffs while preserving its physical ownership of the logistics networks. Second, the structural partition of the energy sector. While the mainstream headlines celebrated the complete removal of the 10% tariff on Canadian crude oil, the financial terms embedded in the text reveal a much stricter reality. The exemption was tied directly to a volume stabilization clause. Under these terms, Canada committed to maintaining a baseline flow of 3.8 million barrels per day into American Midwest refineries, ensuring US energy security. However, Mark Carney successfully fought off an American demand for an exclusivity clause. This was a critical sovereign victory. It meant Canada legally preserved its right to export any surplus production exceeding that baseline through the newly minted Pacific TMX pipeline to buyers in South Korea and Japan, permanently breaking America's monopsony power over Canadian heavy oil. Third, the creation of the sectoral exemption mechanism for high-value manufacturing. This is the exact piece of the architecture that opposition leader Pierre Poilievre fiercely attacked as a national capitulation. Under this rule, over 85% of total Canada-US trade volume was categorized as compliant with the new security protocols, instantly qualifying those goods for zero tariff status on September 1, 2025. For the industrial heartlands of Ontario and Quebec, this was an immediate financial lifeline, halting the bleeding in the automotive and aerospace assembly plants. But the technical catch was severe. Any Canadian exporter failing to meet the rigorous digital tracking standards within a strict 60-day window would automatically default back to the original 25% tariff rate. The financial data that followed the implementation of this complex framework proves that Carney's strategy was not about returning to the old status quo. It was about creating a dual-track economy. Even with the structural relief of the September exemptions, the institutional gravity of Canada's global pivot did not slow down. In that very month, Canada posted a powerful 6.3% monthly export gain. But look at where the growth occurred. It wasn't a spike in routine assembly line goods moving south. It was a massive 22.7% surge in metals and non-metallic minerals, accompanied by a 30.2% jump in unwrought gold shipments, destined for the secure vaults of Switzerland and the United Kingdom. The underlying strategic reality is that Carney used the temporary shield of the cosmic compliance framework to buy the domes, tick private sector, something it desperately needed. Time. By stabilizing the volatile relationship with the United States through high-level regulatory alignment, he managed to stop the immediate panic in the industrial heartland while leaving the global export engines running at absolute full capacity. This was macroeconomic engineering at its most calculated. The government systematically removed the immediate threat of American retaliation without dismantling the newly opened trade corridors to Europe and Asia. By October 2025, this dual-track architecture was functioning with high efficiency. While bilateral trade with the United States normalized under the strict data-sharing protocols, Canada's exports to non-US nations simultaneously hit another consecutive all-time record high. The London bullion market continued to absorb Canadian gold at an unprecedented rate, printing a 47.4% monthly surge, while maritime tankers carried crude oil directly from the Pacific coast to the ports of Germany and the Netherlands. The structural vulnerability that had defined Canadian sovereignty for half a century was being systematically dismantled, not by walking away from the American market, but by building a parallel global network that made American political pressure economically non-fatal. This brings us to the core tension embedded within the new economic architecture. While the political class in Ottawa continues to debate whether this framework represents a historic defence of Canadian independence or a bureaucratic surrender to Washington's regulatory demands, the global markets have already moved past the rhetoric. The numbers don't lie. By the time December 2025 closed out the calendar year, Canada had proved that a medium-sized economy could withstand a direct trade offensive from the world's largest superpower by leveraging its essential commodities and executing a precise, data-driven diplomatic pivot. But as we look closely at the trade data rolling into the summer of 2026, the long-term sustainability of this dual-track strategy faces a deeper, structural challenge that no trade agreement can easily resolve. The sudden macroeconomic realignment of 2025 has proved that when a global superpower attempts to choke Canada's trade pipeline, it does not trigger a national submission. It permanently shatters America's structural monopoly over Canadian resources. By deploying a high-tech data tracking framework to stabilize the southern border while simultaneously routing tens of billions in raw commodities to Europe and Asia, Ottawa did not just survive a targeted economic assault. It systematically rewrote the rules of North American interdependence. When you step back from the daily political theatre and look at the broader strategic horizon, the implications of this structural pivot stretch far beyond the immediate balance sheets of Calgary or Toronto. We are no longer living in the pre-Trump era of predictable, rule-based continental trade under continental agreements, where Canadian planners could safely assume friction-free access to the American market. That baseline is gone forever. The weaponization of the border in early 2025 permanently altered the geopolitical psychology of the Canadian state and its corporate boardrooms. The primary lesson of the trade war is that absolute geographic proximity is no longer an absolute guarantee of economic security. This macroeconomic shift changes Canada-US relations from a deeply integrated high-trust alliance into a transactional, multi-directional strategic hedge. In the pre-2025 paradigm, Canadian trade strategy was defined by institutional inertia. The southern market was simply too massive, too close, and too lucrative to justify the heavy capital investment required to build global alternatives. Washington's aggressive tariff campaign acted as a violent economic shock that did what 40 years of government white papers failed to achieve. It forced the Canadian private sector to bear the immediate logistical and compliance costs of global diversification as an absolute matter of survival on the global stage. This pivot has accelerated Canada's integration into a parallel network of international alliances that operate independently of Washington's political consensus. By funneling record-breaking volumes of unwrought gold through the London bullion market, routing heavy crude oil directly to the industrial hubs of Germany and the Netherlands via the Pacific coast, and locking in long-term agricultural supply agreements with South Korea and Malaysia, Canada has transformed itself from a captive continental supplier into an agile, globally diversified resource powerhouse. The strategic leverage has shifted. When a nation controls the definitive, unsubstitutable baseline inputs of the modern economy, from critical minerals and uranium to agricultural volume and energy, the global market will always build a path to its door. Regardless of the regulatory walls constructed by Washington, the defence and energy security architecture of the continent has been similarly re-engineered under the surface. While the implementation of the Cosmic Compliance Tracking System gave the United States the data-level transparency it demanded over bilateral transit, it also established a powerful legal precedent. Canada successfully maintained its right to export its surplus resource capacity westward, effectively terminating America's historical status as the sole price-setting buyer of Canadian heavy crude. The strategic value of the Trans Mountain Expansion Pipeline has been locked into the continental calculus permanently. It is no longer just a commercial pipeline, but Canada's ultimate sovereign valve against unilateral American policy shifts. However, this newfound global posture now brings Canada directly to its next critical, highly volatile juncture. As the immediate crisis of the 2025 tariff war recedes into a managed dual-track system, the permanent structural challenge shifts inward. The massive macroeconomic gains of the past year were driven almost entirely by large-scale, multinational resource conglomerates capable of rerouting supply chains overnight. The smaller, domestic manufacturing sectors in Ontario and Quebec remain heavily exposed to continental friction. Forced to navigate a highly bureaucratic regulatory sieve just to keep their access to American assembly lines, the next defining decision point for Ottawa will not be negotiated in Washington, but inside its own borders. Prime Minister Mark Carney has publicly committed to doubling Canada's non-US exports over the next decade. A structural goal that requires an unprecedented, state-backed expansion of domestic maritime infrastructure, deep-water port capacity, and specialised trade financing to help small and medium-sized enterprises break their continental dependence. The fundamental question hanging over the future of the nation is no longer whether Canada can find alternative global customers when pushed into a corner, but whether the political class has the sustained strategic discipline to build out that global delivery system when the immediate economic pressure is turned down. The illusion of a safe, predictable continental economic shelter has been permanently demolished, and the architectural blueprint for an independent, globally connected Canadian sovereignty is currently being written in raw trade numbers.